Hello and welcome to Resilience, the global adaptation podcast, the show where we'll be exploring the best solutions and cutting-edge technologies for adapting to climate change.
From climate-resilient forests to the use of artificial intelligence to the power of storytelling, we are coming to you from the United Nations Environment Programme.
In our podcast, we'll be talking to the world's greatest adaptation experts, but we'll also be travelling around the world to meet people on the front lines of climate change to hear personal stories of how they've built resilience.
We're really excited to share some incredible climate success stories with you. Join us as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
So today I'm joined by UNEP's very own head of news, Keisha Kairi. Keisha, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today's Adaptation Gap Report is clear. Climate calamity is the new reality. And we are not keeping up. Earth is ablaze and humanity is exposed. This year, we have suffered the hottest day and the hottest seas in the history books. Humanity is torching the planet and paying the price. The climate crisis is here. We can't postpone protection. We must adapt now.
That was the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres speaking at the launch of the Adaptation Gap Report. This report has become the global touchstone for understanding how we adapt to climate change and, crucially, how we finance that adaptation.
Throughout this podcast, we've spoken about some interesting solutions out there for building resilience. But how to direct the finance to these solutions is, quite literally, the multi-trillion-dollar question.
The stakes could not be higher. Mega floods, heat waves, droughts, climate impacts are accelerating. Yet many countries are drowning in debt, making it nearly impossible to finance the race to prepare.
And the cost of inaction? Well, without adaptation, societies and economies will be at risk of collapse, food security will be in peril, and global stability challenged as rising tensions over scarce resources drive migration and conflict.
Today we'll be unpacking some of this with UNEP's Executive Director, Andersen. We talk about the very latest Adaptation Gap Report, some of the new methods for unlocking the money we need to protect communities, and also why adaptation investment is very smart economics.
Hi, Inge. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Keisha.
So today we're going to be talking about the importance of adaptation finance, which is something you know quite a lot about. But first, we'd like to know a little bit more about you personally. When did you decide that environmental work was your calling? And was there a specific moment, a season, a reason that triggered this passion you clearly have for the natural world?
Oh, dear, Keisha, how much time do we have? This is kind of my life. But even as a little girl, this was something that in my family was very important, especially from my grandma, who was born north of the polar circle and was very anchored in that community. And so her coming to Denmark was like coming to some lush, vibrant world. But when we went to visit her people, it was a very different reality. Trees would go only to your knees, right? It's a very, very harsh environment. So understanding then that what grows and what is very precious. And then I spent some time in Sudan where I saw during the 1980s where we had this extreme drought and catastrophic impact of drought and desertification. And that just reinforced my understanding as a young person how important this was. And at that point, I said, this is going to be what my life will be all about. So there you have it in a nutshell, Kate.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Inga. For our listeners, it's lovely for them to get a little bit of a sense of what motivates our guests and what inspires our guests before we get into the topic. And that topic today, as Keisha said, is adaptation finance. So this month, UNEP has published its Adaptation Gap Report. Now, before we get into the specifics of what the report says, we'd just like to take a step back a bit. Could you please tell us, so when climate experts talk about the adaptation finance gap, what does that actually mean?
So it's sort of simple. If you have a house that's on the coast and you need to build some protection to prevent that it floods. So if you are living in a slum and you are living quite exposed, but it's normally in the floodplain, a low-lying area, what is the cost to protect you in the event that climate catastrophe hits. And what is it that today we're investing to protect you? Maybe we're investing nothing, maybe we're investing a little bit, but what is it that would actually protect you? That's a gap between what we are investing today and what we need to invest to ensure that those people will not be flooded out or will not be hit with drought, or that the harvest will come and that we have secured our water, that we have secured our cities, because climate impacts often come in either too much water or too little water, as well as extreme heat. This is kind of the drivers, right? Too much of the wet stuff, too little of it. And so, but of course, then when you have too little of it, you have harvest failures, you have a price that goes up, you have all kinds of knock-on effects. So we're really just looking at, okay, so since we know that we are living already today in a climate changing world, and since we know that we are already at sort of 1.1 to 1.2 degrees above where we should be, then those climate hits that we are getting today, how are we going to adapt to them, and how much is that going to cost us? That's the story.
Thanks very much, Inga. So, what does this year's report actually say about the gap in adaptation finance? And what does this gap mean to real people who are dealing with climate change in real time?
So the gap that we're seeing, and when you're measuring something as difficult as what I just said, and you take it to the world and the globe, it becomes sort of a little bit of a it becomes a range. And so we just have to accept that the gap lies between around just under 200 billion, 190 billion or so, to around 360 billion. So this is sort of a wide gap because it's very hard to measure what I just explained. But let's face it, 200 billion to 300 to just under 200 billion to 360 billion. These are big numbers, and that's per year. Now, that gap, obviously, we want to close, and we want to ensure that more people are not going to get hit by these climate catastrophes that are happening right now in our daily lives, on our TV screens, in our communities. I mean, we've seen just in the couple of last few months, we've seen, we are seeing these extreme weather events in Southern Africa, which is kind of crazy. I was speaking in the COP16 to some ministers, and they were saying, on the one hand, we have floods in Southern Africa. On the other hand, at the very same time, we have extreme drought, sort of unheard of shifts. We've seen deadly floods in Spain and hurricanes in the US. And the reality is, of course, that we need to invest to protect us from this. Now, the money that I mentioned, the gap, is what it is. When we met in Glasgow for COP 26, and that was in 2021, just at the heels as COVID was ending, we agreed that we would double the finance that goes to adaptation by 2025. And in 2021, we were investing 19 billion, just 19. Put that in perspective to what the gap is. And today, and 2025, we want to hit 38 billion. Okay, that's also real money, of course. But remember this, we just said that the gap is this massive yawning gap that takes us all the way to 360 billion or so. So the reality is that we have a long way to journey. And so that's the story, that even by doubling what we promised each other in Glasgow, we're going to double by 2025. And even if we make it, we're still not where we need to be. And that's really why we push on this adaptation gap understanding, so that there is an understanding that finance will be needed. Because if we don't, then we have a gear shift, and then we go into something else, which is called loss and damage. And of course, it is much, much better to protect your community in prevention than the cost of that community being wiped out. Better for human life, better for the rebuilding costs, which will be much, much more. So it's like medicine, prevention is better than the cure.
So Inga, the really big question that I have for you is, how do we actually close the gap? So how do we increase adaptation finance on the scale that's needed? And what are the most effective ways of doing that?
We think completely differently. Yes, we increase grant financing. But if we think that this is going to be done on the basis of taxes in certain countries that flows, we won't reach those numbers. And that means we need to think about the kind of financial instruments that we can make available. That's number one. And the financial instruments, first of all, and I have to stress that, is that we have to have resilience grants. There has to be grant money in the mix. So don't get me wrong. But over and above, we have to think differently. What about debt for adaptation swaps? We know that many countries are deeply indebted. We've seen other debt swaps. Why not do debt for adaptation? Because I tell you this, if we don't, then the cost of that these countries will have to take on in terms of repairing, rebuilding, and so on and so forth are so much higher. What about resilience credits, extending credits to countries? Because if you are more resilient as an economy, you are performing better. And when you perform better, you become in better investment climate. More countries, more companies will come and invest in your country, and the economic wheels will turn. So it's a smart development investment. What about payment for ecosystem services? You know, the fact that actually all of this forest that may be wiped out by forest fires, the fact that these coral reefs that break the waves, the fact that the mangroves that we protect are like a cushion. What if we made payments so that those ecosystem services that these ecosystems provide for us actually yield a benefit? There are countries that have experimented with that, Costa Rica being the longest in the tooth on this one, having done it now for 20, 30 years. And then there's new stuff that's coming out. It's super exciting. Think about Peru and Cambodia, where they've said to companies, don't pay us your taxes. Instead, go and create this public work that can protect this community. So there's a work for taxes. And then, of course, making sure that we work at the local level, with the local communities, because they're the ones who know best what their needs are, how they will be hit, drought and floods and fires and all of that. But these kind of flows can and must increase our benefits that can really run to these countries, and that becomes absolutely critical. I have to say that, and I have the privilege of speaking with Madam Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. And the thing that she says, she comes from a small island developing nation, and it's a country that has taken on debt to do development for its people. But when we think of a small island developing nation that has done nothing to have climate change happen, and then it gets wiped out by some hurricane or other, and then she is obliged, Madam Motley, the Prime Minister, to go and borrow to repair and rebuild. Maybe she's been set, or the people of Barbados have been set 15 years back. So think about that. Why should Barbados borrow for this, which is something that they have not caused? So we need to have a conversation around debt, which is why we're happy that that's beginning to happen, but it needs to hurry up and hurry up very fast.
So outside of finance, strictly speaking, the report has a special chapter this year on capacity building and technology transfer. Why did we choose this theme as a special focus, and what does the report say about it?
I mean, this is an issue that the world is very, very concerned about, right? Because there are elements that can help us prepare. And one of the elements that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been very focused on is early warning. The fact that there are some countries that simply do not have the systems that will allow them to know what's coming at them, with what velocity, with what speed, and therefore cannot give warning to their population. So we need to understand that those things become access to technology. Let's start there and then get to capacity building, are absolutely critical. Or let's think about resilient infrastructure that we need to build. Is it gray, i.e. something we construct, or is it green, i.e. working with nature-based solutions? What's best in this particular setting? Is it better to plant a coastal forest to break the high winds, or is it better to have a wall, a seawall? Should we continue to straighten our rivers so that they flood over and flood the housing that is right next door to the rivers? Or should we make them meander so that they can breathe as the water rises? These are the kind of conversations that you need to have, but you need to understand the technological impacts of all of this and what tools are available. And many countries have a hard time accessing some of that technology. Now, we at UNEP, we're proud to host the Climate Technology Center, but countries need more. And we need to understand what's cheapest, but also most effective. What are the lessons learned with one technology or another? And how can we ensure that every country doesn't have to sort of begin from the beginning? But if my neighbor or another country has used this particular technology with impact, then we need to transfer those lessons as well. And so I think also, of course, I mean, on the capacity building side, let's make no mistake, people in the global south are as well educated and as well trained, and they have brilliant people doing brilliant things. Many times it's the connecting the technology to those people and with the finance behind them so that it can actually be rolled out on the ground. And that's a dimension that the Adaptation Gap Report really focuses on. And one point we just need to recall, Indigenous people tell us so many things about how things were, how they used to work, how we can use nature's services to us. And so really using Indigenous people's knowledge, including that understanding of nature. So it's not all high-tech geeky stuff. It's also very much just the lessons from Mother Earth in a sense.
We had a very similar conversation. So it's great that you mentioned the Climate Technology Centre and Network. So that's CTCN. And we had a guest on in one of our earlier episodes about innovation, talking about the great work that CTCN are doing there. There's a question I always have when the Adaptation Gap Report comes out. And I think it's a question that doesn't often get asked in the sort of press conferences and the media rounds. And that question is, what would the world look like if we closed the gap? And can you envision a future where we do close that adaptation gap?
Yeah, because we're already making these massive investments. We're just not making them smart enough. Obviously, let's face the fact that the global north is making quite a lot of investments in protecting itself. But as we've just seen a few weeks back in Spain, with these floods in Valencia, we saw that actually even that was not enough. And we saw loss of 200 lives, and any life lost is one too many to climate impacts. And so what I think it would look like is smart infrastructure. When we looked at Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, you may recall that where they still had the mangroves and had not urbanized right down to the shore, it kind of took the buffer. And where we had urbanized right down to the shore, it was devastating, as we saw from New Orleans. So my point of giving the examples from the global north is just to say that we need to work with nature in everything that we do. And that's where nature-based solutions come in, and smart planning. As we are an urbanizing planet, and as more and more of us choose to live in urban agglomeration, then only by bringing and adapting inside the urban environment will we actually be safe. So our urban planners need to think about what that looks like. There's so many ways where we can work with nature, but the world, if we are smart, because we are building the equivalent of one Paris a week in terms of footprint, be very smart about that one Paris a week that we're building. Integrate climate and adaptation into that. And then we have to, since we all have to eat, last I checked, we have to talk about agriculture. What is it that we're doing in terms of smart agriculture, that we grow the right thing in the right places, and that we use the resources, water, soil, etc., in the right way to optimize food production for us all. And that means that the farming of yesteryear will not work for the farming of tomorrow, because we will see shifting weather patterns, which means that we need to have a conversation around the kind of crops we will grow and so on and so forth. And that's hard, right? Because if you come from a farming family and they have always done this, then why should I change? So this is where governments need to engage and provide a sort of back to technology and technical support to ensure that farmers, whether in the north or in the south, east or west, will need to be aware of the possibility of crop failure if you continue with these or these crops. So it is about thinking about creating that resilience in our societies.
It really sounds what you're describing there as a sort of whole of society approach where all the sectors are involved across society. So Inga, in your view, what are some other really important aspects of adaptation finance that the world really needs to consider? You've referred to debt for adaptation, for example. What are some other really interesting aspects that we should think about?
We need to use all of the above and then some. It's insignificant what every little organization, including UNEP, is doing on its own. We need to think about this in a much bigger scale. The entire spread of what we do in development has to have adaptation involved and woven into it. And that means every agency under the sun. Because without this and without that understanding, we just will not, what we invest in today, and it could be a bridge, or it could be a school, or it could be agriculture, or it could be a hydropower dam. What is the consequences? If I take a loan for a dam that I will be paying off over 30 years, but the river will run dry, or the dam will wash out, then it's wasted money. So we need to think about every single investment that we do. So adaptation is the key. Now, at the same time, since we've only been talking adaptation, I have to say that we have to pull the handbrake on our bicycle or whatever on our carbon emissions. We saw in the Emissions Gap Report that last year we increased our emissions by 1.3%. Adaptation will be more and more costly if we don't do what we know is right. And adaptation is something, therefore, that we'll just see the invoice coming up and going higher and higher. And that's the thing with nature, right? You can't argue with it. And it'll just send you the invoices. The bills would just keep arriving. And it's sort of a non-negotiable with nature. We can negotiate amongst humans, but not with nature. So we just need to get that done.
Very, very powerfully put. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us, Inga. It was fascinating. This is the second adaptation event we've been at together, so I think that I know significantly more than I did going in. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, that was UNEP's Executive Director, Inga Andersen, sharing her insights on adaptation finance. If you want to dive deeper into the numbers, check out the full Adaptation Gap Report. We've included a link in the show notes.
Now let's leave you with a stat from the report that brings what Inga has said into sharp focus. Investing $1 billion in adapting to coastal flooding can prevent $14 billion of damage. That is a 14-to-1 return on investment. And it's not just coastal flooding where we see these high ratios. Early warning systems, a 9-to-1 return. And other adaptation solutions have similarly high rewards. These aren't just statistics, they're a call to action. The question isn't whether we can afford to adapt. The question is, can we afford not to?
So that's it from us. Thank you to Inga. Thank you to our listeners. Join us next time as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
This show is sponsored by the Japanese Ministry of the Environment. Richard Myron is the producer, and this has been an Earshot Strategies production.